Welcome back. In this video I'm going to take you through an introduction to the for loop. Now the for loop is incredibly useful. It allows us to loop through any number of things a set number of times, and we can control how many times that might be and indeed when we should stop looping through. So it's a very useful tool, and in the past it was a bit hard to get your head around, but Visual Studio, as you're about to see, makes it very, very simple to understand how to get a for loop actually up and going. So I've already created a WPF application, and I'm going to add a couple of controls that we're going to be using. So I'm going to add a text box, which I'm going to resize a little bit and make it a bit easier to see, and I'm also going to add a button. Okay, as always, I'm going to name my controls before I go any further. So let's call the button loop, and I'll also set the content to loop. And let's name our text box loop. That's it as far as the UI is concerned. So I'm going to now double click on the loop button to create its click event. And now we're in the code view. Alright, so let's get started on creating a for loop. I'm going to type the word for, and I'm going to press tab twice. Well, we'll try that again. For loop, tab twice. There we go. I accidentally hit the Q key there, which mucked things up a bit, but I'm streaming and recording this live, so you get to see all this. Okay, let's have a look at what it's created for us. We can see that we've got a for loop, and we've got a left curly brace and a right curly brace, and there's a blank space in between. And just like an if statement, for example, whatever you put in here is going to happen if the for loop is actually true and it's looping around. And up in the round brackets, we've got the conditions. And there are three parts to a for loop. The first part is talking about what's going to control the loop. In this case, it's a variable called I. It's an integer, so it's actually a number, and it has a starting value of 0. The next part, which starts after the semicolon, says we're going to check how many times we're going to loop, and the condition is going to be if I, our variable, is less than a certain length. And that length at the moment is actually highlighted in red, because that's the bit of the for loop that we do need to change to make this to work. We'll come back and look at that in just a moment. Let's look at the third part, which has got a semicolon, and then we have I++. This is a sort of a programming shortcut that's saying that what we want to do is take the existing value of I and add 1 to it. So if we start our loop at 0, which we are going to, each time it goes through, I will equal 1, then 2, then 3, and so on. We have to tell the loop how many times it wants to actually loop around before we stop, and that's where the length part comes into it. So I'm going to change that length and just put the number 11. And that's going to tell our program to start at 0 and loop around while I is less than 11. Of course, we'd like to see what's going on, so I'm going to take advantage of that text box I put on the form, and I'm actually going to print out the value of I as we loop around. So I'm going to put the name of the text box. Of course, we want to use the text property. And I'm going to go plus equals. Now, normally when we do a text box, we say text box whatever, dot text equals, say Dan. That would simply replace what was previously in the text box with Dan. We don't want to do this. We actually want to keep what was previously in there and add to it. So the plus and the equals is adding whatever we want onto the end of what is already there. This is called concatenation. You can find out a whole lot more information about that on Google if you want to know more about string concatenation. Let's see what it looks like though when I use it. I'm going to add I. Now I is a number. A text box expects a string. So at the moment they're not compatible. I'm going to have to convert my number, I, to a string format so my text box can display the value. And there's a shortcut that lets us do that. If I put a dot after I, one of the shortcuts I get is toString. So I'm going to select that, pressing the tab, and I put brackets in, and that's going to do the conversion for me. Let's put a semicolon on the end, and let's run this application and see what we get. Okay, there's our main window. I'll click on loop. And there we go. We can see that because we set I to start at 0, That 0 is the first number displayed in our text box, and it's counted through 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then 10 is our final number. Hi, Lynn. That's my wife that just walked through there. Anyway, so now we can, that's James. So now we've got the numbers there and it's working. Okay. Okay, so we're back. Thanks to the magic of video, I've actually stopped and went and had some dinner. So I'm feeling good. But I suppose we really need to get back to what we were talking about, which is our loop. And as you can see, we got the result we wanted, but all the numbers are hard up against each other. So it might be a little bit hard to read if we were going through a lot of numbers in our loop. So let's make a simple change to our code to make it a bit easier to read these numbers in the text box. Okay, so on the line where we're actually adding I to string, I'm just going to append onto the end of that by using the plus key and in quotes, comma. Let's run our project again with F5. Across, click on the loop, and now we can see it's much easier to make out the numbers that are going through on our loop. Okay, now of course we're adding 1 to the loop each time we go around, but you might want to change the loop so it's adding a different number. Perhaps it's going up by multiples of 5. So we start at 0, we go to 5, 10, 15, and so on. It's very easy to do. So let's have a look at how we do that and modify our existing loop. Okay. So in our code, you remember we set the default or the starting value of our variable I to 0. We can also select how high the number is going to get before we exit the loop. So it's checking to see if the number we've got in I is less than 11. And that last bit, if you recall, is where we added 1 to I each time we looped around. That's the bit we have to change. So I'm going to take out the plus plus and instead have plus equals 5. And that's the shortcut code for saying that we want to add 5 to whatever I currently is. So the first time through the loop, I equals 0. So next time through the loop, it'll be saying it equals 0 plus 5. So we'll get 5. The third time through the loop, it'll say we've got 5 and we're adding another 5, so we've got 10. Let's see how it looks when we run the program. Loop, and there we go, 0, 5, and 10, because obviously 10 was the last digit we could display before we hit that condition about I being less than 11. Okay. Now you might also want to be able to count, well, before we go on to that, let's say we want, for example, to count from 10 to 30 in 5. So we go 10, 15, 20, and so on up to 30. Well, there's a couple of things we'd have to change. First of all, we'd have to change the starting value of I to the first number we want, which is 10. The other bit we'd have to do is change the condition that we're checking for. Now, at the moment, it's going to stop running in the loop when it gets to anything that's above 11. In our case, we want to count from 10 through to 30, so I'm going to adjust that to 31. And we're going to leave the increment at 5. Let's see what happens. So I press F5. There's our main window. And now we get 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. So we've learned how to change the starting value of our loop. And we've also learned how to set what we're counting by, whether it's by 1, or in this case by 5. And we've also learned how we can adjust the ending value. By, in this case, adjusting it so we're saying that the number we want to display has to be less than 31. That's all well and good. Another good example where you might want to use a loop is when you want to count backwards. So what if we want to start, for example, at 10 and count our way back to 0? How would we modify the loop to do that? Let's have a look. First of all, we need to look at the starting value. Now I've got it set to 10. That's fine for this example. Remember, we're going to count back from 10, 9, 8, 7, and so on. But I don't want to check to see if our value is currently less than 31. That wouldn't make any sense. What I want to do is make sure our value is actually greater than 0. So I'll change those values there to greater than, oops, 0. What happened there? We just lost a space. There we go. And now I need to change the increment. Now at the moment it's adding 5 every time it loops. We don't want that. We in fact want to subtract 1. Now if you remember when we first did the for loop, our increment looks something like this, I++. That was a shortcut for adding 1 to the existing value of I. You can probably guess what I'm going to do next. If I put I minus minus, we take away 1 from the existing value of I. That will help us with our countdown from 10, 9, 8 and so forth. Let's see what we get when we press F5 and run our program. And there we go. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It worked. Now if we wanted to include 0, we'd have to make another subtle change to our code. Let's have a look at that one before we finish. At the moment, I'm saying the condition for I is it has to be greater than 0. So 0 doesn't count. That's why we saw the number 1 as the first number that showed up in our text box, well, last number in our text box. What I'm going to do, if my cursor would stop playing up, is I'm going to add equals. So now I'm saying I is greater than or equal to 0. Let's try pressing F5 and see if that does what we want. Okay, there's our text box, click on the loop, and there we go. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. So that's how you can use our loop. But you can use other things in loops other than just counting numbers up and down. So the last example I'm going to use is what I call the Big Bang Theory loop. I'll take out the existing loop and I'll make a new loop. Okay, so we're back to the default values, remember? So we're starting 0, we're checking for something that's less than a certain length, and we're adding 1 every time we loop. I'm going to set the length to 3. Okay, that works fine. And each time we go around the loop, I'm going to add a message to the text box. So I'm going to say plus equals Penny. Now you might remember when Sheldon wants Penny's attention, he knocks on the door 3 times and says Penny, Penny, Penny. So we're going to do that in our loop. Of course, it would be nice if our text didn't just appear one after the other, but actually appeared on a new line, and we can do that. Now, in the old days, we used to call this a carriage return, which is based on what a typewriter did. You got to the end of the line and you would flick the carriage across and it would move across again and down one line. The equivalent of doing that in C# is we add plus and then environment dot new line and a semicolon to finish. So this is going to print Penny and then force the cursor down to the next line. Let's see if that works the way it is now. Press F5. Click our loop and we get our 3 pennies. The last bit, of course, is when Penny answers the door, we'd like to ask her a question. So we're going to add one more line to our program. Now this last line I don't want to repeat like we did with Penny. Now if I don't want it to repeat, that's giving me a very strong suggestion that I don't want it inside the loop, because anything I put inside the loop is going to repeat. So I want this last bit that we add to the text box to happen after we finish the loop. So I look for the end of the loop, that's the right closing brace for the loop, put a new line in below it, and now I can put in something I want to only happen once at the end after the loop is finished. So there's our text box, and I'm going to say equals that's correct. We got to learn it as your friend, isn't it? So, semicolon. Let's see how that looks. Hang on a minute. I thought that it should say Penny 3 times, and it didn't do it. There is actually something I left out of this, and I was wondering whether you actually see it. If you remember when we did Penny, we made sure that we kept the previous ones by using the plus and the equal sign. That meant we kept what was in the text box and added the next bit. That worked fine for the loop. But when I went and added this bit at the end, I just said equal. So in fact what I did was replace all the pennies just with the one line. I don't want that, of course. I'd like it to look just like it did with the penny. So I'm going to use the plus or equal sign to concatenate or join that last part to the 3 pennies. Let's see what it looks like now. And there we go. We have our Big Bang loop. There's plenty of resources out there about loops, and there are actually other types of loops as well. But once you master this one, the rest become pretty straightforward. So it's a great one to start with. Practice it a few times, get comfortable with it. Feel free to ask questions about it and watch this video as many times as you need to feel confident about how the for loop works. Thanks.